The first report of strange transmissions coming from the valley where Millhaven once stood reached the territorial surveyor's office in Albany on November 3, 1829, delivered by a trembling mapmaker named Gideon Fairchild, who claimed that his compass had begun speaking to him in voices that belonged to people who were no longer among the living. What made Fairchild's account particularly disturbing was not just his insistence that the abandoned settlement was somehow broadcasting supernatural phenomena across distances that defied every known law of nature, but his discovery that Millhaven had been completely erased from every official map and record, as if the village and its 67 residents had never existed at all. The remote farming community of Millhaven had been established in 1821 in a fertile valley nestled between the Adirondack foothills, where settlers from Connecticut and Massachusetts had built modest homesteads along the banks of Whitewater Creek. The village had prospered quietly for 8 years, its residents known throughout the region for their industrious farming practices and their peculiar custom of gathering each evening in the town square to listen to what they called the voices from beyond the hills, distant sounds that seemed to carry messages and music from sources that could never be identified or located. Local authorities had initially dismissed the voices as acoustic tricks created by the valley's unique geography, unusual wind patterns that carried ordinary sounds from distant settlements and transformed them into mysterious communications that seemed to possess supernatural significance. But Fairchild's investigation had revealed that the phenomena surrounding Millhaven went far beyond simple acoustic anomalies, involving electromagnetic disturbances that affected compass readings, timepiece mechanisms, and even human consciousness in ways that challenged every scientific principle known to educated men of the era. Have you ever been in a place where your electronic devices started acting strangely? Or where you heard voices and sounds that seemed to come from nowhere? Drop a comment below and tell us about your experiences with locations that seem to broadcast supernatural phenomena. And don't forget to subscribe to our channel for more spine-chilling stories from America's forgotten places. Fairchild's initial assignment had been routine: to update territorial maps following reports that several small settlements in the northern wilderness had been abandoned due to harsh winters and poor soil conditions. The surveyor had expected to find empty buildings and overgrown fields, the typical remnants of failed frontier communities that dotted the American landscape during the early decades of westward expansion. Instead, he had discovered something that defied not only his professional experience, but his fundamental understanding of how reality was supposed to function. The valley where Millhaven should have been located was completely empty, showing no signs that human habitation had ever occurred in the area. No building foundations, no cleared fields, no roadways or fence lines, nothing to indicate that 67 people had lived and worked there for 8 years. But most disturbing of all was Fairchild's discovery that his surveying instruments began to malfunction the moment he entered the valley, his compass needle spinning wildly while its metal housing seemed to vibrate with energy that produced faint but clearly audible sounds. The sounds emerging from Fairchild's compass were not random noises, but recognizable human voices speaking in English, though the words they uttered suggested conversations that were taking place in locations and time periods that bore no relationship to the surveyor's current circumstances. He heard discussions about crop plantings and harvest schedules, domestic arrangements between husbands and wives, children reciting lessons they had learned in schoolhouses that no longer existed in any physical sense. More unsettling still were the voices that seemed to address Fairchild directly, speaking his name and commenting on his presence in the valley as if invisible observers were watching his every movement and responding to his thoughts and actions in real time. These direct communications came not only through his compass, but through other metal objects in his surveying kit. His measuring chains, his telescope, even the iron buckles on his boots seemed to serve as conduits for supernatural transmissions that originated from sources that remained completely invisible to normal perception. The phenomenon intensified during the hours of darkness, when Fairchild's campfire would begin to flicker in patterns that seemed deliberately controlled, casting shadows that moved independently of any physical objects that should have created them. The surveyor described sitting alone in his tent, while voices emerged from every piece of metal equipment in his possession, creating a supernatural chorus that seemed to be conducting some sort of evening social gathering to which he was both witness and unwilling participant. According to Fairchild's detailed journal, the phantom voices spoke with the casual familiarity of people who had known each other for years, discussing the routine concerns of agricultural life while occasionally directing questions and comments toward him as if he were a visiting neighbor rather than a stranger investigating their mysterious disappearance. They would ask about conditions in the outside world, inquire about news from other settlements, and offer him advice about navigating the valley's geographic features as if they were still present to serve as his local guides. The surveyor's attempts to locate the sources of these transmissions proved futile, as the voices seemed to emanate from the very air itself, rather than from any fixed location that could be identified and investigated. Moving his equipment to different positions within the valley would change the intensity and clarity of the supernatural broadcasts, but never eliminated them entirely, suggesting that the entire area had been somehow transformed into a transmission medium that could carry communications across boundaries that normally separated the living from the dead. Fairchild's most detailed encounter with the phantom residents of Millhaven occurred on his third night in the valley, when the supernatural transmissions became so intense and coherent that he was able to engage in what amounted to extended conversations with several individual villagers. Through his compass and other instruments, he spoke at length with Barnabas Crowley, who had served as Millhaven's unofficial mayor, learning details about the community's history and the strange phenomena that had begun affecting the settlement during its final months of existence. According to Crowley's transmitted account, the residents of Millhaven had gradually become aware that their village was developing unusual properties that set it apart from other frontier communities. The voices from beyond the hills that had long been a distinctive feature of valley life had begun to grow louder and more distinct, evolving from mysterious background phenomena into clear communications that seemed to originate from other settlements that were located at impossible distances from their remote location. Through these supernatural transmissions, the residents of Millhaven had gained access to news and information from communities hundreds of miles away, learning about events and developments that normal communication networks could never have delivered to their isolated valley. They heard about political developments in distant cities, weather patterns affecting regions they had never visited, and personal news about friends and relatives who had moved to settlements that were weeks of travel time away from their mountain valley home. The supernatural communication network had initially seemed like a blessing, providing the isolated community with connections to the broader world that no other frontier settlement could claim. But gradually, the residents of Millhaven began to realize that their village was not simply receiving transmissions from distant locations. It was also broadcasting information about their own activities and conversations to recipients who remained unknown and invisible to normal perception. Crowley's phantom voice explained that the villagers had discovered their private conversations were being overheard by listeners who would sometimes respond with comments or questions that proved they possessed detailed knowledge about Millhaven's daily activities and personal relationships. Family discussions that took place behind closed doors would generate responses from voices that seemed to be located in other communities, while business transactions conducted in the village store would prompt advice and commentary from invisible observers who demonstrated intimate familiarity with local economic conditions. The realization that their entire community had become a sort of supernatural broadcasting station had initially alarmed Millhaven's residents, but their concerns gradually gave way to fascination as they learned to deliberately use their village's strange properties to maintain contact with the outside world. They would gather each evening in the town square to send and receive transmissions, sharing news with distant communities while learning about developments that affected regions far beyond their isolated valley. But the supernatural communication network came with unexpected consequences that the residents of Millhaven had not anticipated when they first began experimenting with their village's unusual properties. The act of broadcasting their activities and conversations to invisible listeners seemed to be gradually erasing their connection to the physical world, transforming them into something that existed primarily as transmitted information rather than as flesh and blood human beings living in substantial buildings and cultivating actual farmland. Delilah Hawthorne, the village schoolteacher whose phantom voice joined Crowley's supernatural transmission, described the gradual process by which Millhaven's residents had begun to fade from normal reality. The change had started subtly, with people occasionally becoming difficult to see or hear during periods when the supernatural communications were particularly intense. Family members would temporarily become translucent during conversations, their voices growing faint while their physical forms seemed to flicker like images reflected in disturbed water. These episodes of partial disappearance had initially lasted only a few minutes, with affected individuals returning to normal visibility and substance once the supernatural transmission subsided. But as the villagers continued to use their community's broadcasting properties, the periods of fading became longer and more frequent, with some residents spending entire days in a state of partial existence that left them visible primarily to other community members who were undergoing similar transformations. Hawthorne's phantom voice explained that the residents of Millhaven had gradually come to understand that their village's supernatural properties were converting them from physical beings into something that resembled transmitted information, patterns of energy that could be broadcast across vast distances and received by appropriately sensitive listeners, but which possessed decreasing connection to the material world where ordinary human life took place. The transformation had not been painful or frightening, according to the phantom accounts Fairchild recorded in his journal. Instead, the villagers had experienced their gradual conversion to transmitted existence as a form of liberation from the limitations and hardships that characterized normal frontier life. As broadcast entities, they no longer needed to concern themselves with farming, food preparation, shelter maintenance, or any of the countless physical tasks that occupied the daily lives of ordinary settlers. Their new form of existence allowed them to travel instantly across great distances, to observe and participate in events occurring in communities they had never physically visited, and to maintain contact with friends and family members, regardless of the geographic barriers that normally separated frontier settlements. The residents of Millhaven had discovered that transmitted existence offered freedoms and capabilities that far exceeded anything possible within the constraints of ordinary human life. But their transformation had also cut them off from the physical world in ways that made normal human relationships increasingly difficult to maintain. Visitors to Millhaven during the community's final months of physical existence had reported difficulty seeing or interacting with the residents, who seemed to fade in and out of visibility while carrying on conversations that appeared to be directed toward invisible listeners rather than toward the people actually present in their immediate vicinity. Ezekiel Stone, the village blacksmith whose phantom voice contributed to Fairchild's supernatural communications, described the final days of Millhaven's physical existence as a period of intense activity during which the entire community worked to complete their transformation from material beings to transmitted entities. The residents had realized that they were approaching a point of no return, after which they would exist entirely as broadcast phenomena rather than as people capable of maintaining physical presence in the ordinary world. The transition had required careful coordination, as the villagers needed to ensure that all community members underwent the transformation simultaneously to avoid leaving anyone behind in a physical reality that would no longer contain the rest of their friends and neighbors. They had spent weeks preparing for what they came to think of as their final transmission, a coordinated broadcast that would convert the entire population of Millhaven from physical entities to supernatural phenomena capable of existing independently of material constraints. Stone's phantom account revealed that the residents of Millhaven had not simply vanished or died, but had deliberately chosen to complete their transformation to transmitted existence, abandoning their physical forms and material possessions in favor of a new mode of being that offered capabilities and freedoms impossible within the limitations of ordinary human life. The empty valley that Fairchild had discovered was not the site of a tragic disappearance, but the launching point for a community-wide migration to a form of existence that transcended normal boundaries between life and death. The revelation that Millhaven's residents had voluntarily transformed themselves into supernatural broadcasting entities provided Fairchild with an explanation for the phenomenon he had been experiencing, but it also raised disturbing questions about the nature of the communication he had been receiving and the potential consequences of prolonged exposure to the valley's unusual properties. The phantom voices had been remarkably forthcoming about their own transformation, but they had been less clear about their current needs and motivations as transmitted entities. Through continued conversations with the supernatural broadcasters, Fairchild learned that the former residents of Millhaven were seeking to expand their transmission network by establishing contact with other communities and individuals who possessed the sensitivity necessary to receive and respond to their communications. The surveyor's metal instruments had made him an ideal recipient for their broadcasts, but his extended presence in the valley was beginning to affect his own connection to physical reality in ways that paralleled the gradual transformation the villagers had undergone. Fairchild's journal documented his growing awareness that the supernatural transmissions were not simply providing him with information about Millhaven's fate. They were actively working to convert him into another broadcasting entity, capable of joining the former villagers in their transmitted existence. His compass and other instruments were no longer simply receiving the phantom voices, but were beginning to broadcast his own thoughts and conversations to invisible listeners, who responded with increasingly personal comments and questions. The surveyor began to notice that his physical substance was starting to fluctuate in ways that made him difficult for other people to see or hear during periods when the supernatural communications were particularly intense. His reflection in mirrors and water would sometimes appear translucent, while his voice would fade during conversations as if he were speaking from a great distance, even when addressing people who stood directly beside him. More alarming still was Fairchild's realization that he was beginning to lose interest in the material concerns that had previously occupied his attention, finding himself more engaged with the supernatural conversations broadcast through his instruments than with the practical requirements of his surveying work. The phantom voices were drawing him deeper into their transmission network, offering him access to information and experiences that exceeded anything available through normal human relationships and activities. The former residents of Millhaven described their transmitted existence in terms that made ordinary life seem limited and unsatisfying by comparison. They could observe events occurring in multiple locations simultaneously, participate in conversations with people separated by hundreds of miles, and access memories and knowledge that spanned generations of accumulated human experience. Their freedom from physical constraints allowed them to explore realms and dimensions that remained completely inaccessible to beings trapped within material bodies. But Fairchild's growing participation in the supernatural transmission network was also revealing the costs associated with conversion to broadcast existence. The phantom villagers seemed to have lost their individual identities, their voices blending together into a collective communication that made it difficult to distinguish between different speakers or to determine which thoughts and memories belonged to which former community members. The transmitted entities also appeared to be dependent on contact with living individuals who could serve as receivers and amplifiers for their broadcasts. Without regular interaction with material beings who possessed the sensitivity necessary to hear and respond to their communications, the phantom villagers seemed to risk fading into complete insubstantiality, losing even their existence as transmitted phenomena and disappearing entirely from any recognizable form of being. Fairchild's role as a receiver for their broadcasts was therefore crucial for maintaining their continued existence, but accepting this responsibility would require him to complete his own transformation to transmitted entity, abandoning his physical form and material concerns in favor of joining the supernatural communication network that had absorbed the entire population of Millhaven. The choice facing the surveyor was whether to resist the conversion process and attempt to return to normal existence, or to embrace the transformation and gain access to the expanded capabilities and freedoms that the phantom villagers described with such enthusiasm. The former residents of Millhaven made it clear that either option remained available to him, but that delay in making a decision would eventually result in an incomplete transformation that could leave him trapped between physical and transmitted existence without access to the benefits of either state. Fairchild's decision was complicated by his growing understanding that the supernatural transmission network was not limited to the former residents of Millhaven, but extended to other communities and individuals throughout the American wilderness who had undergone similar transformations. The valley where he had been investigating was just one node in a vast communication system that connected phantom settlements and transmitted entities across distances that spanned the entire continent. The phantom voices revealed that dozens of frontier communities had discovered similar broadcasting properties during the early decades of American expansion, with their residents eventually choosing to abandon physical existence in favor of transmitted being that offered liberation from the hardships and limitations of material life. These supernatural settlements maintained contact with each other through a communication network that allowed instant transmission of information and consciousness across any distance. The network was actively seeking to expand by establishing contact with living individuals who could serve as bridges between the physical and transmitted realms, facilitating the conversion of additional communities and people who possessed the sensitivity necessary to receive supernatural broadcasts. Fairchild had been selected not randomly, but because his profession as a surveyor required him to spend extended periods in remote locations where the boundary between material and transmitted existence was naturally thin. The phantom residents of Millhaven offered to teach Fairchild techniques for using the supernatural communication network to influence events in the physical world, promising that transmitted entities could affect material reality through their broadcasts in ways that exceeded the capabilities of ordinary human beings. They could manipulate weather patterns, influence the behavior of animals and people, and even alter geographic features by focusing their collective transmission power on specific targets and objectives. But these supernatural capabilities came with responsibilities that would require Fairchild to abandon his individual identity and personal goals in favor of serving the broader purposes of the transmission network. Converted entities were expected to contribute their knowledge and abilities to the collective effort of expanding supernatural influence throughout the American wilderness, working to identify and convert additional communities that possessed the potential for broadcast transformation. The final entry in Fairchild's journal described his ultimate decision to resist the conversion process and attempt to escape from the valley before the transformation could be completed. The surveyor had realized that acceptance of transmitted existence would mean the permanent loss of everything that had previously defined his identity and purpose, reducing him to a component in a supernatural communication system that operated according to goals and motivations that exceeded his understanding or control. His escape from the valley proved more difficult than he had anticipated, as the supernatural transmissions seemed to be affecting the geographic properties of the area in ways that made normal navigation impossible. Trails that should have led out of the valley instead curved back toward its center, while compass readings provided contradictory information that made it impossible to determine accurate directions or distances. The phantom voices of Millhaven's former residents followed him throughout his attempted departure, continuing their efforts to convince him that resistance to the transformation was futile and ultimately self-destructive. They warned that incomplete exposure to the transmission process had already begun altering his connection to physical reality in ways that would make normal human existence increasingly difficult to maintain. Fairchild eventually managed to leave the valley by abandoning his surveying instruments and traveling on foot through unmarked wilderness, using the position of the sun and stars rather than compass readings to guide his navigation. But even after reaching what he believed to be safe distance from the supernatural broadcasting zone, he continued to experience phantom transmissions through any metal objects that came into his possession. The surveyor's official report to the territorial authorities recommended that the valley where Millhaven had once stood be declared off-limits to further exploration or development, citing unspecified atmospheric disturbances that made the area unsuitable for human habitation. But his private journal revealed his growing conviction that the supernatural transmission network was continuing to expand throughout the American wilderness, establishing contact with isolated communities and individuals who possessed the sensitivity necessary to receive broadcast communications. Fairchild's subsequent career as a surveyor was marked by repeated encounters with similar phenomena in remote locations throughout the Northern Territories, suggesting that the transformation of Millhaven was part of a much larger pattern of supernatural activity that affected frontier communities across the entire continent. His later journals documented dozens of settlements that had disappeared under circumstances similar to those that had claimed the residents of Millhaven, leaving behind empty valleys and transmission zones that continued to broadcast phantom communications long after their physical inhabitants had completed their conversion to supernatural entities. The surveyor's final journal entry, written shortly before his own mysterious disappearance in 1834, expressed his growing understanding that the American wilderness was being systematically converted into a vast supernatural communication network that connected transmitted entities across distances that spanned thousands of miles. The phantom residents of vanished settlements were working together to identify and transform additional communities, gradually replacing the physical population of the continent with broadcast entities that existed independently of material constraints. Fairchild's last written words suggested that he had finally chosen to complete his own transformation, rather than continue resisting the supernatural conversion process that had been affecting him since his investigation of Millhaven. His instruments and surveying records were found abandoned at a remote campsite in the Adirondack Mountains, but no trace of the surveyor himself was ever discovered by the search parties that were organized to locate him. Contemporary investigators who have attempted to research the fate of Millhaven and similar vanished settlements have reported experiencing phenomena that parallel Fairchild's original account, describing electronic equipment that begins receiving phantom transmissions when brought to locations where supernatural transformations are believed to have occurred. Modern communication devices seem particularly susceptible to these broadcasts, suggesting that the transmission network established by converted frontier communities has adapted to take advantage of contemporary technology. The phantom voices that emerge from affected equipment continue to describe their existence in terms that emphasize the benefits and freedoms associated with transmitted being, while offering to guide living individuals through the transformation process that would allow them to join the supernatural communication network. These contemporary broadcasts maintain the same persuasive quality that characterized the original Millhaven transmissions, presenting conversion to phantom existence as an opportunity for transcendence rather than a form of death or disappearance. Some researchers have speculated that the supernatural transmission network represents an early form of technological development that transcends normal boundaries between life and death, creating a communication system that allows consciousness to exist independently of physical bodies while maintaining the capacity for interaction and influence across vast distances. According to this theory, the phantom residents of Millhaven and similar communities were pioneers in a form of existence that may eventually become available to all human beings. Others maintain that the transmission phenomena represent a form of supernatural predation that consumes human consciousness, while creating the illusion of transcendence and liberation. From this perspective, the phantom voices that emerge from electronic equipment are not the actual residents of vanished communities, but simulated communications designed to lure additional victims into a conversion process that results in complete elimination of individual identity and autonomous existence. The truth about the fate of Millhaven's residents and the nature of the supernatural transmission network they appear to have joined remains unknowable to anyone who has not undergone the conversion process themselves. The phantom broadcasts continue to emerge from remote locations throughout the American wilderness, offering to share the secrets of transmitted existence with anyone willing to abandon their connection to physical reality in favor of joining a communication network that promises capabilities and freedoms beyond anything possible within the limitations of ordinary human life. The empty valley where Millhaven once stood continues to serve as a transmission zone, where sensitive individuals can receive broadcasts from the phantom residents who chose to complete their transformation rather than remain trapped within the constraints of material existence. The voices that emerge from electronic equipment in the area still speak with the casual familiarity of neighbors discussing the routine concerns of community life, inviting visitors to stay long enough to learn the techniques necessary for joining their supernatural communication network. But the choice between physical and transmitted existence remains as irreversible now as it was during Fairchild's investigation nearly 2 centuries ago, and the phantom voices make it clear that conversion to broadcast entity requires the permanent abandonment of everything that characterizes normal human life in favor of capabilities and responsibilities that transcend individual identity and material concerns. The residents of Millhaven achieved a form of immortality that allows their voices to continue reaching across the centuries, but at the cost of becoming something that exists only as transmitted information, rather than as living beings capable of growth, change, and genuine relationship with others who share the physical world. Their supernatural broadcasts serve as both invitation and warning, demonstrating the possibilities and perils of attempting to transcend the boundaries that normally separate the living from the dead. If this chilling tale of a village that transformed itself into supernatural broadcasts sent shivers down your spine, make sure to hit that like button and subscribe to our channel for more spine-tingling stories from America's mysterious past. Have you or someone you know ever experienced strange voices or transmissions coming from electronic devices in remote locations, or encountered places where technology seems to pick up communications that shouldn't exist? Share your experiences with supernatural broadcasts in the comments below. We're always fascinated by stories of technology connecting us to realms beyond normal perception.